All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for our panel, the role and responsibility of the media in reporting on race and equality. We have three great panelists with us tonight. Before I introduce them, I just want to do some housekeeping. If you haven't as of yet, please put your phone on or your device on mute so that we won't have that extra interference. In the chat room, if you have questions that you have a question that you want to have asked, you can drop it in there. I have the chat thing open, so I'll be looking at that for additional questions to engage the audience and our panelists with. So thank you so much for coming out and joining us. Let me introduce our panelists for the evening, or let me introduce myself for those of you who may not know. I'm Conway Gittens. I am a reporter for Reuters Television. I cover business news, and I'm a board member of the New York Financial Writers Association. This is my second spin as a board member. And so we decided we wanted to put together a panel today to discuss this topic. And joining us tonight are our three guests. We have Kadia Tubman. She is a editor at Insider. We have James Blue. He is a senior producer and special events coordinator at the PBS NewsHour. And we have Trevor Hunnicutt. He is a 2020 campaign reporter for Reuters. So we got new media, old media, TV. We got it all for you tonight. So let's start with a overarching question for our guests, and we'll get into discussion. So why is a discussion about race and the media so important now, right? What have we been doing all this time? Have we just been basically just talking past one another? So I want to start with James. He's the senior of the group. So let's start with you, sir. You're on mute.
Yes, yeah, I took your directions really well. Hi, I'm James Blue, and I'm the executive in charge of all the special projects coming out of PBS NewsHour. Really glad to be here and was honored for the invitation. I think the reason why it's so important to talk about race and to really cover race at this moment is that there's been a sea change in our country. For the first time, millions of Americans have stood up in support of what we know as Black Lives Matter. If you think about 5 or 6 years ago, Black Lives Matter was this nascent movement. I have the great fortune of knowing one of the founders, DeRay McKesson. DeRay is from Baltimore, Maryland, which is where my family lived for many years. And we got to know DeRay. And, you know, he really found it difficult. None of the mainstream civil rights organizations really wanted to embrace them. They didn't like their style. They didn't like their tactics. And really what has happened through the unfortunate killing that happened in Minneapolis, the country has sort of come together and really sort of said, enough is enough, what do we do now? And so I think the challenge as journalists that we have is to find out where are the places where there's an intersection between what we report and race. How do we expand upon it? How do we explore it? And how do we help our audience, our viewers, our users understand how central this is to who and what we are? Be it the economy, the campaign, you know, race is there. And I think what I'm so excited about, the people who've worked on race issues for the past, 15, 20 years, they always thought that there was a ceiling, that there was only so much that they could do. What the moment we have now really shows you that there are lots of possibilities for them to think differently and for them to think bigger. And I think for the allies of many, many different colors, they're now sort of joined at the hip. We are not advocates. We are trying to tell stories. And I think it's just something that this moment requires of us. And that's what I'll stop for now.
So we'll talk a little bit more about Black Lives Matter in a minute. Let me just say this. Trevor Hunnicutt, our campaign reporter for Reuters, is actually on his way driving back from Delaware. from covering Joe Biden today. So if you hear a car noise in the background, that's him on his way back. So let me turn to Kadia. It's the same question, but in a slightly different nuance. Why is this introspection that we're having right now so important? Not just in Black circles or white circles, but that we have this introspection in shared circles.
Right. And so thank you, one, for having me. And so I'm the news editor at Insider, Business Insider. And one point that James made I thought is important is that phrasing that this is all happening now all of a sudden, I don't think that's the case. I think certain people are catching up. But there have been a lot of newsrooms that have set aside either reporters or beats that have been focusing on race. Is that which newsrooms have valued it more than others? That's the question we're coming to now. We are, like you just said, Conway, coming to a point where we're saying, well, all of us have to talk about this. This consciousness is not just going to have to be segregated out. The only issue is that me saying that we've been doing this for years and activists have been doing this and experts have been talking about it and beats have been developed for years, that this is not just happening in a vacuum. It goes to say that it's been isolated and been talked about and worked on in silos. And a lot of the times from the folks in those groups, you would hear that it needs to be a collective effort. If we're going to have a person or a reporter focusing on race, or we're going to have a part of the newsroom focusing on race, inequality, discrimination, it can't be separate or separated from the newsroom, the larger newsroom, especially in areas that are targeted to politics, to business. Like, these areas are typically pulled apart and race becomes its own little thing on its own side, and it's never really fully integrated. And some newsrooms I've been in and I've seen have been able to try and attempt it, but it wasn't until this moment where we saw all of it colliding. We saw health, we saw politics, we saw finance, all of it colliding around this moment. And that just proved that operating in these silos wasn't going to get anyone anywhere. And a lot of folks and a lot of newsrooms are just insider's perspective, like from the newsroom, from us, the news desk, it was just like, okay, these protests are happening. What's going on? Then we're talking to the politics teams. What's coming out of the White House? What's coming out of legislation? And then we're talking to the finance and business teams covering business. And they're asking us, oh, all of these companies are doing X, Y, and Z. Here's the fallout. And we were all seeing each other cross over in a way that we hadn't done before. So yes, this moment is expressing something that has always been existing, that we've all worked in silos, and it's just going to now come together at a point where we're saying this topic encompasses everything and it crosses everything. And the more we come together, the stronger we're able to have the most accurate information to put out there for people to go forward with.
So, Trevor, for a second, I just want to just talk a little bit about this movement is not new. It seems like sometimes we're talking past each other. But I wanted to ask you, what in terms of our white colleagues, what are they missing, right? Sometimes when we start talking about race, people get hot under the collar because just because we're talking about race, they think that we're saying that they are racist. And so they don't hear anything that we say after that. So I'm just wondering, what are some of the things now that we're in this moment and the attention seems to be on this discussion, what are our colleagues missing?
Thank you for having me, first of all. I am Trevor Hunnicutt, and my main qualification is that I'm a friend of Conway's. That's why I'm on this panel tonight. I think just kind of another contextual thing that it's important to remember here is that when you're thinking about the media industry, most of the companies that we work for are somewhere between their business models are somewhere between challenged to just utterly dysfunctional. And over the last decade, you've seen a real decimation of the talent pool that's available to cover stories generally. And you've seen the file get hollowed out, where only the areas that are kind of most kind of core get resources, and some of the areas that were considered kind of marginal, including a lot of features having to do with race and justice, got hollowed out, and the people who told those stories had their jobs eliminated. And now a lot of these media companies, having discouraged people of color from even joining, And from having active careers in this industry, now they're realizing that their audiences want more information about these issues. And audiences are demanding more stories on these topics, and newsrooms in many cases don't have the personnel to be able to tell those stories well. And so what we're seeing is now a lot of people are getting brought in from other areas of the file to fill that hole. And you're seeing now new roles being created to cover issues of race and justice because the readership demands it, and because on some level, investors and media companies are demanding it, right? Because you've got this whole ESG movement that is, environmental, social, and governance, where the investors are saying, now, wait a minute, what kind of diversity and inclusion and metrics are you looking at in your own company? And so now media companies have to kind of do a 180, and they have to think about diversity in a much more serious way, because it is actually affecting their bottom line and their ability to compete on key stories. And so that's kind of, I think, what we're seeing at a lot of our media companies right now is the stories are not, these stories are really competitive. The talent to tell them is really competitive. And so media companies are playing catch up right now. And I think that's true of our company, and it's true of lots of other places too.
So
the point that Trevor's making, that playing catch up with limited resources, that to me really necessitates activating the entire newsroom, activating the Black employees, the gay employees, the Hispanic employees, the Asian employees. Because the models are so challenged, why wouldn't you want everyone activated toward the articulated goal? And so, yes, part of this challenge is to impact what we're covering, but also part of this challenge is to make sure we're covering it with the right people. And that's where I think a lot of the internal work can be done as well.
And so there may be people, all of us are journalists basically on this line. So there may be people who are not Black, and they say, hey, I want to be an advocate. I want to be part of the solution. I don't want to be part of the problem, but I really don't know how to help. I don't really know what to do. So what are some of the things, because we want to be positive in this conversation as well. So what are some of the things that people who want to be advocates, what are some of the things that they can do to help further this along? And any one of you can answer that.
Well, I can go. I mean, I'm not sure if I have strategies on how to be the best advocate, but I'm always pushing back on the idea that it only takes a certain kind of people, or a certain kind of person rather, to cover an issue. And so when I was working at, for example, as Yahoo News, when I was working in politics as a reporter, half of the stories that were being told about racism in Flint or with police brutality were not being written by Black or people of color journalists, because one, they didn't have them, but also those stories were magnificent. Like the fact that those reporters were able to say, I am a reporter first and foremost, and my job is to accurately cover information and to recognize the biases I have, and then I'm going to go do the extra work when writing those kind of stories to make sure I do it justice. And so I'm always worried about saying, like, if there's going to be Black issues, we get a Black reporter. Yes, we should always have perspectives and multiple perspectives in the room, but it doesn't mean, I've worked with reporters of color who actually get things wrong, and I have to check them on their biases, because again, I think that goes for everyone. But more importantly, I want to focus, if we're looking at the positive side of it, is that anyone can approach this. If you have the courage enough to do it, and you're willing to stay as open-minded and dogged in your work to cover these issues, then I'd rather get that person above anyone just by saying that they just qualify because they fit a bill to be considered qualified enough to report on it. With that, in terms of being a good advocate and ally, it means more than just empathizing. At this moment, we're hearing a lot of folks who are outside of the community say, like, man, I see this now, I understand it now, I'm taking it in, and I empathize. But we need more than empathy. We need you to really act on that. And that part, I think, is going to be really hard. Because that means educating yourself outside of your normal education, reading things that you probably don't know, getting more submerged into reporting that you haven't heard from before, the likes of George Floyd or Black Lives Matter. There's more work to be done, and that is the part that's going to, I think, either help a lot of people move forward or at least stop that progress from happening. Because once you tell people you have to act, that's extra work outside of their day job, outside of their beat, likely, outside of their goals for their teams. And so when we outline that kind of work, that's the next step. And whether we give those people who are willing to do that work the latitude to do it.
So
to Doug,
go ahead.
I was just gonna add something to that, which is, I'm a big believer in collective action. And I think, this is something that takes all of us. I mean, and a lot of these issues hit gender, they hit race, they hit sexual orientation, they hit income, they hit lots of things all at once. And when your colleagues ask for help them. When whether you're at the Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times, and something inappropriate is happening in your institution on a racial level, and your colleagues are speaking up and they're asking for your help, join them. Be willing to speak up and add your name to open letters and do walkouts, because a lot of these, there just aren't, we don't have enough people for an issue to just be a Black issue, right? There just aren't enough of us in most newsrooms for us to have critical mass to really make a huge difference without allies and without alliances. And so that's, I would just encourage people to just have an open heart and an open mind and an open ear and hear what your colleagues of color are saying and asking for, and see if there's a way that you can lend your voice in support of them. And another thing that I would just shout out you for, Conway, is thinking about sources and who it is that we're quoting and choosing to lift up as experts within our stories. And one thing that I love that you've done is really highlighting how we can get people of color in those coveted positions of expertise that we offer in our stories. And so I would encourage all of the journalists that are listening in on this to really think about what kind of diversity do you have when you quote people, and really just kind of look through your stories and see who you're quoting and who you're lifting up.
And so how important is this discussion of being an ally, being an advocate, how important it is for the younger journalists when they're coming into the newsroom, when they're just getting their feet in the door, to have someone to help steer them in their career advancement? James?
Oh, you're on mute, James.
Sorry. I should say, just to be clear, I'm not an advocate. I am a very curious journalist. And for me, that distinction is really, really important. I certainly advocate for people and for coverage, but I really am not certain that I would ever call myself an advocate in that way. And so I just want to, just to slightly answer the last question, what to do if you want to help. We are journalists. We're curious people. Be curious about something that you may not know about. Be curious, well, why aren't there so many Black editors? Why aren't there many women editors? Be curious about those things and ask questions about it in the same way that we interrogate the topics that we cover. And so I think if you bring that same curiosity and that same inquisitiveness to the work that we do, I think that would help our newsrooms. As it relates to being mentors, I really do believe that any of us can be a mentor for any number of people coming into the newsroom. I remember when I was starting at NBC, my mentor turned out to be this older white guy who had been an AP person. He'd written copy for the AP during World War II, and then eventually ended up getting into radio, and then ended up getting into television. And I really didn't know that he was being my mentor. It just sort of happened that he recognized that I had something and it wasn't formal. He just sort of really sort of took me on and helped me find my way in the newsroom, which is really what it's all about. And it's not necessarily, I may be contrarian here. We don't need any more programs bringing in folks into the pipeline. The pipeline is full. What we need is when people come in the door, we need to make sure they're given opportunities and responsibilities that are going to grow and develop them. My second year at NBC, I got sent overseas to work on a big project in Africa. It was amazing, and it sort of made me decide I want to be a foreign correspondent, which eventually I did when I worked at ABC. It's really about giving people opportunity, being curious, and definitely developing them so that they can go on and do great things.
All right, we're going to talk about careers a little bit in second bit of this, but I just wanted to talk a little bit more about some things that are happening on the front line. So, you know, we've seen a number of media outlets go to using a capital B in terms of defining, you know, Black people, Black culture. And I was wondering, for people who may think like, well, what does that matter? Why does it matter? Why is it a big deal? Is it a big deal? And what does it say, if anything? And I'll start with Kadia, since you're editor.
Yeah. So 2 weeks before, or maybe a week before they actually announced that, generally across the board at many newsrooms, I had one reporter reach out to me on a story he was working on, and he capitalized, a white reporter. He's like, I capitalized the B in Black, and I've been doing that this entire time, but apparently AP says, the style book says we don't. I was like, that's interesting. So I double checked and I was like, oh wow, it does say it's a lowercase b. I did not know that. I always thought it was a capital B. I also assumed that white was also capitalized. But once it kind of grew, literally 2 weeks later, it became news, and he came back to me. He's like, well, I guess we were right the first time. And everyone else just caught up, which was pretty cool to see. There are a lot of people who've been capitalizing B. For it to catch up and get into, and now it's institutionalized, that's a big deal. That's saying that people are paying attention to the work of activists, advocates, experts, theorists who have been writing this way, who've been talking this way, and stating the claim as to why it's important to capitalize the B in Black. That means we're actually bending towards accuracy and justice in reporting, especially in newsrooms, the same way we would put respect on any other group and the way we put them in our stories. And so just seeing that happen, it was a magnificent moment for a lot of newsrooms, because it said, wow, we literally just made a huge institutional change easily. It was easy. It was just like, we declared it and then we're gonna do it. And it's like, if we could do that after we've learned just so much in such a short time, just a small change. So imagine what else we could do down the line with anything that's much bigger than just capitalizing a letter.
But do you think readers notice the difference, especially beyond the first day when the news organization said, from now on, we're going to be capitalizing B? You know, do news readers know what it means, and do they understand it, or is it a lost moment?
Well, I don't think it needs to be a moment. I wouldn't want to call it out to say like this is, I think internally for us, it's a moment. For our audience, it should just be like, this is standard. This is the way it has to be. This is the way it should have been. Let's just keep on moving on. I think the people who did notice, and not many of our readers who came into my inbox ever said like, hey, why don't we capitalize this, this, and this, and this? The ones who did were like outraged that we don't capitalize everything, and they had a pointed backlash to it, which is always going to happen when we see changes like this. But the people who were for it, and a lot of people are for it, didn't actually think it was a big deal. It was like, okay, you're capitalizing it. Good job. Good for you guys. Pat on the back. And I don't think we need to take a moment to say like, hooray for the journalism and media world for doing this, because then it kind of makes us look bad, because there's other things we could have possibly doing differently other than just, like I said, capitalizing a letter.
So Trevor, was that the capital B just a low-hanging fruit? And what is it that newsrooms need to be doing in terms of the content and the coverage that we are doing?
Yeah, it was low-hanging fruit, which is I don't want to diminish it in any way because the symbolism is extremely important. I think it reminds people of two things. One, which is that the term Black is something that we chose. It was a way for us as a people to define ourselves when other words were being used about us. And if you go back and you look at newspapers, in the 60s and 70s, we weren't called Black, right? We were called Negro. We were called lots of other kinds of things. And capitalizing the B is an important historical recognition of the fact that this is an identity that was chosen by us for a reason. And it's also a reminder that Blackness as a social construct is different from Black the color, and that it's something that makes people think a little bit more about race, I think, in a critical way. So but it was an easy decision for all of these news organizations to make because it was a simple change in the style guide, and it was something that everybody kind of moved on at once. I think it's much harder to do the real systemic work of enfranchising Black journalists within newsrooms where resources are tight, where you have the coronavirus pandemic that is causing people not to hire, not to give raises, in many cases to do layoffs. And so I think the harder work of resource management within these newsrooms is going to be something that the primarily white leadership in those newsrooms is going to continue to struggle with. And I think that's going to be the key challenge going forward.
One of our viewers has a question. Are there any other any other word choices that we should be deliberate about? And how do we advocate for those, especially if you are a person of color and you're in a newsroom where you're one of only a few? How do you advocate for that without ruffling feathers? Anyone can answer that. Anybody?
I don't know. I think I'm a little more skeptical. I would spend more time advocating for. I would spend more time advocating for the journalism that we want to do. And I'm not saying that the capital B isn't important, but I am saying I certainly rather see us go deep on the Black experience and use a small b than to capitalize the B. I think we've done our work.
Okay. Are you going to change your background every time we see you?
Possibly. Possibly. I have kids to feed. You know that.
Okay. So we have a question about Black Lives Matter. How has Black Lives Matter impacted the newsroom? Like those of us who are in the newsroom, how does it impact us? Has it helped us in getting our voices heard inside our own newsrooms? Does it create a problem if we don't agree with Black Lives Matter, or we don't agree with some of the tenets of Black Lives Matter? How is Black Lives Matter actually impacting those of us in the newsroom? Let's start with Kadia.
Yeah, sure. So about 2 years ago, I started covering Black Lives Matter when I was covering politics, and got to know a lot of the leaders, especially here in New York, of what they wanted to get out as a message and how often that message got muddled. But for newsrooms, what Black Lives Matter did was pull in the context of what a lot of people were fighting for. And so a lot of the times when you can't summarize that you want voter enfranchisement, or if you can't summarize that you want to have safer neighborhoods that are self-governed and unpoliced, or if you can't contextualize, like you can't pull all these large concepts into, if you want to pull it into one phrase, it became Black Lives Matter. And so when newsrooms, the ones I have been in, were trying to approach these very hard, very large topics that were being put out by the Black community and through Black Lives Matter, they looked to this group. and the tenets that they were putting out, because it was assumed that this group was speaking for what this community wanted. And so the way that impacted newsrooms was actually giving more context and a place to go where you can get all the pinpointed information of what people wanted in terms of change from this community, rather than just going out and trying to find random experts and people to speak to. One issue that I think it comes to groups like Black Lives Matter is that you're trying to speak for a whole group of people, and sometimes those missions and those messages get mixed and they're different and they're disagreed upon. But at the same time, when it came to journalists and like myself who were looking for one clear voice, it was going to Black Lives Matter and starting from there. And I think that's one of the benefits that they have. But at the same time, they always have stated that they are not centralized. It's not speaking for all Black people, but it is a starting point. And for a lot of newsrooms, Black Lives Matter, or at least referencing it and knowing what they stand for, is a starting point to getting to understand the vast history and needs and challenges and opportunities that this community is always trying to push for.
So because we are the New York Financial Writers Association, what do financial journalists, Trevor, I'm going to call on you, what do financial journalists need to understand about the economic goals and economic beliefs of the Black Lives Matter movement? And has there been adequate coverage of those economic goals and beliefs? And if not, what needs to be better understood?
That's an excellent question that I'm going to need to reflect on a little bit. I mean, I think that, wow, you gave me the hard one. That's great. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, which is, it's really a loose collection of people who are making lots of different kinds of political claims. I think that there isn't necessarily one coherent economic message that you hear out of the Black Lives Matter movement. What you do hear is a need for representation. You do hear a need to think about broader structural changes in society that go beyond just criminal justice reform, and also go to asking deeper questions about, well, why is it that that minor, petty economic offenses like the one that George Floyd was accused of in Minneapolis get responded to by multiple police officers, right? He was accused of passing a fake check, if I remember correctly, right?
Fake $20 bill.
Fake $20 bill. Okay, so why do those kinds of economic matters get policed the way that they do? And I think that opens up kind of an entire can of worms for us as people who write about the economy, to really think about those questions, like the criminalization of poverty, I think is one big theme that we could write a whole lot more about. As financial writers, we tend to focus on the big banks and we tend to focus on big companies, but there's definitely room for us to look at, well, now, what are the patterns of lending that happen in this country, right? Why is it that when you look at Black people's houses, that they don't appreciate in the same way that white people's houses do? I think it gives us a lot of space and a lot of reader interest to be able to explore some really important questions.
And I'm going to lean on you again, just because I know you were our investments correspondent before you were on the campaign trail, and then I'll open it up to James and Kadia too, because I'm sure they can weigh in. And because we are the Financial Writers Association, some people might be scratching their head and said, is this the whole idea of, talking about race and talking about equality, is this a subject that a group like this should even consider tackling? Because we should be focusing on financial news. So so I'll just leave it there.
Well, I mean, regardless of whether you are personally interested in this subject matter, this is something that is going to continue to be a critical matter for financial markets. I just came back from an event today with the Democratic presidential candidate, Joe Biden, and he said that he thinks that the Federal Reserve Act should be amended so that the central bank considers racial gaps in wealth, income, and unemployment as part of their central mandate. So if you're not in a position to write about what that means in terms of banking regulation, if the Federal Reserve Act gets amended in that kind of a way, then you are going to be more limited as a journalist.
Could you talk to me about that intersection between race, politics, business? I mean, you worked at Yahoo Finance, now you're an editor at Insider, and their sister company is Business Insider. So I know you kind of traverse in that world.
Yeah, so I mean, it goes back to the point of what Black Lives Matter has been requesting when it comes to economic policy. It's not just, oh, we want a redistribution of wealth, or we want better jobs. It's like they're asking for renegotiation of trade deals. They're asking for reevaluation of public and private loans. They're asking for different tax incentives. Like it's large. It's larger than just what, and that's the amazing part. Black Lives Matter and the group itself is not trying to really target a micro scale level of economic change. They're going after large international private and public changes. So when we talk about finance and we talk about business, to leave out this community would be a huge disservice, because they are looking for this information, especially when it comes to, as we are seeing now, disparity in pay, when it comes to wealth and the distribution, and what's that going to look like in the next 2 years. And then also what's going to happen after, or even while the rest of this pandemic is going on. They're clamoring for this information. One thing I can point out is that for example, for us, huge news right now is the stimulus check. And a lot of the news around that, the traffic that's driven to our site, I see that coming from these communities that are typically underrepresented in this topic. And so they are clamoring for this information, and they're looking for the right people to give it to them. And the newsrooms that can cater to these communities while providing the insights that you all have is going to be a huge benefit down the line, because this is going to just become more and more top of mind for these communities as we get through this pandemic, get through an election, and then go on for the next 2, 3, 5 years.
So one of the things, Conway, I'd like to just have people reflect on is just the way we treat criminals differently. No one expects an insider trader to be stopped and have a person's knee put on his neck. But in theory, they are both alleged criminals. But because one happens to be Black and poor, and because one happens most likely to be white and wealthy, they are treated differently. They are both potentially, innocent, until proven guilty, but they are both, in the eyes of the law, equal. But we as journalists, we as our society, don't treat them equally. And I think one of the things that you guys as financial journalists ought to think about is, why is that? Why do we not, why do we treat them differently? I think that's something for you guys to kind of think about and ask yourselves about.
All right, thanks. So we're at the halfway point. So I want to shift. We talked about content. I want to talk about inside the newsroom now for a little bit before we have time for some questions. So I'm going to start with you, James, because you were a senior editor. Why is the media world having such a problem when it comes to the hiring and the promoting of people of color? James, you're on mute again.
Yep, no, I'm unmuting. I think that's a good question. Hang on 1 minute. Hang on. Look, I don't think we've done a very good job in putting ourselves out there, and I can only speak about what I do at the PBS NewsHour. I think that in large part, we haven't created the awareness. So, if you ask the average journalism grad or the average college grad, they have no idea what the PBS NewsHour is. I have the good fortune of being an adjunct at Columbia. I had the opportunity to create a fellowship, and this is my first time teaching. I had 3 Black students in my class, and the fellowship was for someone to come work at the NewsHour for about 10 weeks with the hopes that at the end of that 10 weeks, they would be able to get a job with us. None of the Black students applied, and I went back to them asking why, and the reality was they're just not interested in what we're doing. I find that really disappointing because the person I ended up hiring is getting such amazing hands-on experience that I would have killed for at his age doing some of the stuff that he's doing. To answer your question, I just don't think we have enough people. We're not in enough of the right places. We're not necessarily recruiting at the HBCUs. The challenge with public media, our salaries are really low. Our salaries are about 20% lower than commercial media. We also, I think, in terms of some of the other competing networks, we are not a 24-hour channel. We have 1 hour that we put on every day. We also have a website. But I think those are some of the challenges that we have to overcome. Once we get people in the door, I think they are interested, they are developed, and they grow. But I do think that's a real challenge for us. And I think we haven't worked hard enough.
But talk to me about getting people in the door, because I know when we had our little chat yesterday, you were telling me about an incident in which you had some candidates and you brought them to the people who hire and they were basically rejected.
Yeah, so it's one of those strange things, because you think once you become a boss that you can just sort of make anything happen, and I can tell you that's not the case. And yes, I had 2 people that I wanted to slot into positions. One was a student at an Ivy League college. Another was a student at a very prestigious college in DC. And the gatekeeper, we sent in the resumes, said, this is a good person. And the gatekeeper was concerned because neither of them had studied TV journalism. Now, that is an internal problem that we have to fix. You don't need to study television journalism to come into an entry-level job in a newsroom. And so my executive editor went back and spoke to both people, recognized that they were both talented, and in fact, I think we're going to hire one of them to start working for us in September. So this was really personally upsetting because we've not been able to hire a African-American male for a long time in this sort of editorial role. I think we will do it in September, as we've asked this young man to apply again when we have a new sort of round coming. But it was disappointing that, as one of the most senior people in the office, I guess maybe things do work out for the right way. But yeah, I was very disappointed.
So Khadija, you have a different side of it. You have a different story, because the Insider has been hiring people as of late. And I was wondering, when I was thinking about it overnight, like, what is so different about the Insider that made the environment conducive for you to hire more people of color?
I mean, for me, it comes down to the people in the leadership positions. And I love how James pointed out, like, what you think when you're a boss, then you have the power to change everything. And that's like, whoa, I love that he pointed out that it's not necessarily the case. So when I stepped into the editor position and became manager and was in charge of hiring my new team, as it was expanding in the past couple of months, if not weeks, we had a slate of the candidates that we were looking at. And these were candidates who applied over the course of a few weeks. And when it came down to it, my deputy editor, actually executive editor, looked at the list and she was like, this is not diverse at all. And I told her, I thought this is a list we had to go with. I didn't think we could go out there. You said we're hiring fast. Let's just go with the pool we have. And then she was like, you know what? Scrap it. Go out. Let's go out. And she did the work too. She sent it out to her network, asking for a diverse set of applicants. And that's what we got back. We ended up hiring 2 women of color to join the team event at the end of that 2 weeks or 3 weeks of recruitment. And they've been fantastic ever since. And I guess what's different at Insider is just having people who value diversity. Now I could have had, my executive editor is a white woman, and she could have very well said, okay, let's go with what we have. Let's just keep moving. We have to do this fast and fill the spot so we don't lose the money for it. Instead, she said, let's put a pause. Let's not rush because we're crunched for time. Let's be considerate of this, and let's see who else is out there that we could be talking to. One thing we found out is that we weren't advertising our positions, our open positions, to a lot of the diversity groups out there, like NABJ or NAHJ and so on and so forth. We were just putting out on LinkedIn. And it kind of goes to what James was saying, there's usually a certain group of people that think, oh, I can go to PBS NewsHour, or I can go to Business Insider, and I can go to Insider News, and I can go to Reuters. And there's a group of them who are Black and brown who are like, I would never be able to get in there, or they would never take me because, I mean, look at them. I even had one applicant that I turned down, a woman of color who, like, you know, she kind of, in her reply after I told her, no, thank you, she responded, well, I hope you get some diversity. And I was like, well, excuse me. I hope so too. But the fact of the matter is I don't know how she looked at the team or how she looked into Insider, but she knew that we weren't diverse either. So for her, it was just like, well, you know what, maybe I dodged a bullet by not going there because I'd probably be one of the few people of color there. And so externally, there are reporters, brilliant reporters of color, of diverse backgrounds, who are saying, well, I don't think I could work there because look at their staff, look at their writers, look at their editors. None of them look like me. None of them are from where I'm from. I doubt that I'm going to have success. And then the more we hear stories from journalists of colors at New York Times, at BuzzFeed, and so on and so forth, talk about their pretty terrible experiences, that's just going to discourage them even more and more for looking at really great positions. And so we have to do the work internally, and we kind of need people in leadership roles who might not be people of color, who will have to be people who are white, who are male, who are cis, who so on and forth, who are going to have to step forward and say, well, are we opening up our pool? Are we looking at everybody? Are we missing out because we're just going to the same group of people who keep coming to us? There are some brilliant people who probably would succeed at Insider or Reuters and so on and so forth, but they don't know it yet. And it's a part of our due diligence of making sure that they know it. And so the difference at Insider is that I have leadership internally who are like, this is a problem, so let's fix it. Easy. We don't have to make a big to-do about it. We don't have to sit in several meetings. We have to make a plan. We look at a problem, our team's not diverse. What can we do? Reach out to diverse people. All right, we solved the problem. That's how it works.
So, Trevor,
Conway, could I add something onto
Sure.
that? Because, you know, I'm just thinking back, you know, one of my first internships was unpaid. And I was talking to one of the editors about it, and they said, well, you know, you're lucky to have this job anyways, and you don't have to fill out any tax forms. And it's just kind of emblematic of how I think this industry treats talent and treats its workforce. And I think that in some ways our lack of diversity is a representation of the fact that we devalue the work, and we devalue the people who do the work, and we don't pay them enough. And at some point, you're not going to be able to get the best talent to walk in the door if that is how you treat people on the way in and throughout their careers. So I think we really need to be thinking about, as we get into leadership positions within these organizations, how we can move to business models that are more humane to the people who create journalism. And that, I think, will solve a lot of these diversity issues.
And do you think there's a new hazard emerging in our industry where there's a lot of these new internships and sponsorships and NABJ fellowships in which people of color are being asked to come in, not even at an entry level, but they're being asked to come in below the entry level, but their white counterparts who are graduating from the same journalism program that they are graduating from are going in an entry-level job, but you're being given a fellowship or a temp job, and then it's like you have to prove yourself even more while your white counterpart doesn't have to.
Yes, we have so many positions in this industry that are perma-lancers, perma-interns, the people who are working full time, but they have been placed in a classification that allows their employer to get away with not treating them fairly. And it means you're constantly on eggshells about, well, will I still have this job tomorrow? Am I going to be full time? Am I, you don't have the same protections. In some cases, you don't even have the same time off, the same holidays, as people who are full time. So I think it's a huge problem, and I think it does disproportionately hurt people of color.
So James, we talked about this a little bit in our pre-chat about the whole idea of the whitelash, the backlash when we're talking about diversity and in opening up new positions for people of color. There's, I guess, an idea that if you're hiring more people of color, then you're hiring less, white people who are traditional in the newsroom, and how long does that happen before there's some kind of revolt or some kind of ill feeling towards the diversity and inclusion movement, especially in an industry like ours that is where the jobs are contracting?
Yeah, I think we have some good things going for us. Journalists think of themselves as good people, and most journalists want to do good. That's just sort of the nature of kind of who we are and the way we kind of see ourselves. I think whenever we're talking about change and trying to make changes in these newsrooms, there is going to be a price to be paid. And the fact that we only have one opening means we can only hire one person. I think if you're deliberate, if you're transparent in the way that Khadija and they were at Insider, we want a minority candidate. I think people can handle that. What I say to people who complain, and I get a lot of complaints, regardless of what it is, I say to people, just do the work. Our salvation is in the work. If we do really good work, if we're black, brown, gay, straight, whatever, if we do good work, you will get rewarded for it. And maybe I'm being Pollyannish, but that for me has always been the saving grace. Just work hard, do good work, and you will get noticed. But
when we hear from these media people, we're always saying things like, well, we can't find enough qualified black journalists. That's why our newsrooms are so thin. Or we get them, but we can't keep them. So it's not so much that the people are not doing the work. They're not getting an opportunity to do the work.
Right. In some newsrooms, they are not getting the opportunity to do the work. That's 100% accurate. And they come and then they have to do the work, and then they have to do the work in trying to make the newsroom right, and you don't get compensated for it. When I was at ABC, I was asked to join the diversity committee, and I really took umbrage because the white boys weren't asked to join the diversity committee. And I was, at the time, a young producer. I was winning lots of awards. And it just didn't make sense for me to leave what I was doing, the journalism, to come and endorse a process that I didn't respect. And I basically said to them, if you hire, support, and promote people who look like me and fewer people who look like you, we won't need a diversity committee. I now recognize that that was a very naive approach, but I sort of believe if we find really good people, black, brown, whatever, and we're able to support them in the work that they are called to do, they will rise and they will get to the top. Yes, they have to have doors open. Yes, they have to have consideration, but I do believe they are talented enough to really make it.
All right, I want to get ready to open up some questions because we want to keep this to an hour, and I have my stopwatch here. But I wanted to I'll ask Kadia, how important is it when we're talking about, if we merge the two discussions together about the content and the coverage and what we want to see and the stories that we want to have covered and how they are covered, and then talk about what the newsroom looks like, how important or how vital is it that we get people of color in editor roles, I should say, senior management roles? How important is that?
Super important. I feel like that should be like period at the end of that. I mean, one thing I always say is like having a seat at the table is crucial, but being heard is a whole different idea and a different concept. And you have to make a space for that. A lot of places say, well, we hired a Black senior editor, we're good. It's just like, well, if that editor can't speak up and tell you and point out issues and say like, hey, we're doing this wrong, or we're doing this a disservice, or we're not getting this right, and then it blows back, and then you wait and see, well, why didn't it work out? We have this Black senior editor, why didn't we get this right? Why are we getting called out for X, Y, and Z? There is a difference between having a seat and having a voice. And so if we are going to hire and bring people into the editor's table or into those higher positions where they presumably have power to affect change, then we actually have to give them that power and let them hold that in a way that actually affects change. With that, I mean, it's super incredibly important to have folks in those spaces. But as I said before, it's about getting things right and having the due diligence of getting things right. And that means either hiring someone who's going to get it right, hopefully most of the time, or at least going out and making sure that you're getting to the right people who are going to help you get it right. So that could be a person of color, that could be a Black person sitting at the table, or that could be a person who's going to go out and get the information that your company and your newsroom needs to make sure they're not doing a disservice to covering race, covering justice, or covering topics that are not typical to them. And so, yes, I'm going to say it's important to have those people at the seat of the table so they can point out what you should be looking at and the context that's always necessary. But at the same time, everyone should be building up that power to look for that kind of context.
Trevor, I'm going to pick your brain as the clock ticks down. In terms of political coverage, right? What are we as an industry? I'm talking about the whole industry, not Black, not white. What are we getting wrong? As you're on the campaign trail and you're following Joe Biden, and there's so much focus on him and whether he's going to pick a Black woman for vice president. I mean, what are we getting wrong as an industry?
I mean, I think a lot of things, but I would just start with two things. I think that there is a tendency to treat various ethnic groups as a monolith in our coverage. And we tend to make assumptions that are not rooted in reporting or data about what Black people will and will not like when they show up at the ballot box, or what will or will not motivate Black people to vote for a candidate or not. I think the discussion of the idea of Joe Biden picking a Black running mate being seen as obviously something that is going to help him with Black voters is an assumption that by and large is not borne out by the actual reporting. And I would love to do and see more stories about what that decision will actually mean for people and for different segments within the Black community. And I think, there's also a tendency in political coverage to over-rely on polling in general, but I think that's especially true when it comes to covering minority groups, because when you look at these polls, the sample sizes on Black voters, on Latino voters are so small that the kind of conclusions that you're making about what the community thinks or does not think is actually not really rooted in science when you have sample sizes that are these small. So I think it's just really important to be aware of the fact that polling generally is not always tremendously helpful. And when you're dealing with polling that's talking about Black people or Latino people or Asian people, that polling really is not necessarily going to be reflective, because the pollsters just haven't they haven't talked to enough people to come to scientifically valid conclusions.
Right, and to Trevor's point, I just want to say that a lot of newsrooms are going to depend on those pollings, especially if they don't have people who are willing to go talk to those communities, or they don't have people who are equipped to do it. And so that's either they have people of color or Black people in their newsrooms, or they have white people or non-Black people who are willing to go talk to those people in the first place. So if they don't, they're usually going to rely on those polls, which, as Trevor says, you can't always rely on.
Great. Say, James, I know for the last, I think about 8 years, you've been producing a special for PBS on race. Can you just fill us in, enlighten us? What has that been like? Have you had to pull teeth over there at PBS? Have you had to pull rank? What has it been like trying to produce, for so long, these topical discussions for such a wide-ranging broadcast like PBS?
Yeah, thank you. It's really been a pleasure. I think everyone recognizes that this is something that needs to happen. And this moment, just today I was talking to a potential funder about, supporting our enterprise. I think what I can say mostly is that we have really felt that we have been on the pulse as things have happened. We have been able to, cover it, and we've been able to do these discussions. And I think we've been able to do it across the country. So it hasn't just been on the coast or, with Hollywood stuff. I think the thing that I would say that the lesson that I've learned is that as much progress we've made a lot of progress. There's still a lot to do, but there's also amazing people in all stripes who are doing amazing things and who are thinking about this in really new and creative ways. And so I think for me, that's been the thing that I've learned most about our Race Matters series, that it's not simple, it's complex, and we've been able to get that into our reporting. And that's been really quite good for me personally and professionally.
All right, great. So my clock says I have about a minute left before the hour is up. So here's what I want to do. I want to end on a positive note. We've
taking questions?
Huh? I've been giving you questions. They've been writing them in the chat room. I've been giving them to you as we went along. So I want to end on a positive note. I always believe that after you cut somebody with surgery, you have to sew them back up, or they're going to be walking around bleeding, wounded, right? So we took an introspective look at our industry, what we're doing wrong, what needs to be done, what needs to be fixed, how we need allies. So I just wanted to go around to our panelists and just give me some optimism. Give us some optimism to share with the people who are on this call. Let's start first with Kadia.
Yes. Thank you, Conway, for hosting this and for all the magnificent questions you were able to ask and just holding this kind of space. I think it's wonderful. My optimism comes from the fact that there are a lot more folks who are conscious now and aware, and that awareness is going to lead to more mentorship, more sponsorship, that I don't think a lot of folks are either comfortable or aware that they could be in a position of doing. A lot of you on this call are I believe are in positions to help other people. And if you aren't already, then that space is open to you. I know David Grinberg in the chat asked about mentorship and how important it's been. It's the sole aspect of how I have been able to get anywhere in any of the career spaces I've been in. And all of my mentors have been white men who are like, I see something in you and I want to help you open doors, but they also have a different perspective on life than I do. And they are trying to impart that on me, that kind of courage, the kind of bullishness to get through anything that I normally wouldn't have as a Black queer woman. And so a lot of them took it upon themselves and they were from different industries, whether it was a partner at EY, a global anchor, and ABC News, or now my global editor-in-chief, who literally sets up a meeting every month with me to just talk about how I'm going to strategize in becoming a top editor in the next 2-3 years. And so I'm just hopeful that because so many people are aware of what's going on and what people like myself who are young, who are of color in this industry need, and we do need as much help and allyship we can get, that there are going to be more folks who are on this call and beyond this call who are going to who are going to take up that charge to be that ally, and to be that mentor.
James?
I'm just encouraged that people are using this moment to both look inward and outward. I'm very, very concerned and realize that we only have a nanosecond to actually get something done. And so what I would encourage all of us who've sort of participated tonight is to go do something. We've talked a lot, we've seen a lot of coverage. Go do something, activate, and really start the change that you think you can control and contribute to.
And we'll wrap it up with Mr. Trevor Hunnicutt.
I mean, I think what I have to say is very similar to what a lot of other people have said, which is that I've seen a tremendous amount of willingness to be allies among people from across all kinds of groups, and to see the interconnections of when one person suffers and gets abused, that we all do in a kind of way. And you know, and I've been really heartened to see just how many people have stepped up and said, you know what, things are just not right. And it doesn't matter whether I have to pay a price for saying that and doing something, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's just a matter of right and wrong. You know, I'm generally pretty cynical about these things, but I'm very heartened to see people act in a way that seems pretty selfless.
Great, thank you so much. If we were in a real room, I would say give a round of applause to our panelists. We're on Zoom. So we want to thank Kadia Tubman. We want to thank Trevor Hunnicutt, and we want to thank James Blue for taking the time out of their busy schedules to help enlighten us and give us some information that we could use in our career. And we're going to wrap it up. I just want to wrap it up with this final thing. And Trevor had alluded to it. One of the things that I've done since Juneteenth is I've been looking for all of the Black financial like planners and stock market pickers and fund managers that I can find, because I feel like, you know, working in business news, you know, all the anchors are white, all the reporters are white, all the talking heads are white, and there's so much diversity.
Present company excluded.
Huh?
Present company excluded. All the business reporters aren't white.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, but a lot of them are. But so that's one of the projects that I've taken on, just trying to expand my source list to include diverse voices, and not just Black people or people of color, but also women. So anyway, that's it. That's my little 2-second soapbox. Thank you so much for joining us, and just be on the lookout for emails from us, from the New York Financial Writers Association. We're going to have more panels, more Zooms going forward, so look out for some of our next events. All right? Thank you for joining us. Have a great night.
Thank you.